The pristine lights of National Broadcasting Network in Manhattan cast their calculated glow across the polished anchor desk as Elizabeth Thomas adjusted her earpiece and prepared for the evening's live segment. Across the country, millions of viewers settled into their living rooms, ready to watch their trusted primetime host discuss wildlife conservation with her characteristic blend of authority and grace. Professional competence *. Elizabeth had delivered thousands of these broadcasts over 5 years. She knew exactly how to maintain perfect posture, how to deliver information with the precise balance of gravitas and accessibility that had made her one of the network's rising stars. Foreshadowing the transformation *. But in the next 90 seconds, everything she thought she knew about success, about sacrifice, about the bonds that transcend time and continents would crumble into dust on live television. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hi, subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story. Because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The inciting moment *. The wildlife expert entered through the studio's side entrance, leading a magnificent adult cheetah on a specialized restraint system. Elizabeth continued her scripted introduction, her eyes fixed on the teleprompter, explaining conservation efforts in East Africa to her nationwide audience. The cheetah moved with practiced calm at first, accustomed to educational appearances. Then he stopped. His spotted ears rotated forward. His amber eyes locked onto the woman behind the anchor desk, and he began to make a sound that cheetahs only make for those they have bonded with since infancy. A low, rumbling purr that filled the studio like distant thunder. Character's emotional break *. Elizabeth froze mid-sentence. Her professional mask shattered. She whispered a single word that her producers couldn't understand, but that changed everything. She whispered the name Shadow, and then her voice failed completely. Transition/time jump setup *. Before we witness what happened next in that Manhattan studio, before we see a moment that would be replayed over 30 million times in the following days, we need to journey back. Back 5 years. Back to the day when a passionate young conservationist knelt beside a dying cub in the Kenyan wilderness and made a choice that would define both their destinies. Thematic statement *. This is a story about connections that science says cannot survive separation, about memory that defies what experts believe possible, about a love between a woman and a wild predator that endured 5 years, 2 careers, and the relentless march of time that should have erased it completely. Audience engagement *. If you believe that animals remember, that they grieve, that they love in ways we are only beginning to understand, then you need to hear the story. Because what you're about to witness will shatter everything you thought you knew about the bonds between species. Emotional promise *. This story is about to break your heart and rebuild it in ways you never imagined possible. Backstory transition *. Elizabeth Thomas was 29 years old when she first stepped off the plane in Nairobi, carrying nothing but a volunteer contract and a determination to make a difference in wildlife conservation. She had left behind a promising journalism career in Chicago, trading city lights for African sunrises and the chance to work hands-on with endangered species. She had no idea that in 6 months she would be forced to make a choice between love and ambition, a choice that would haunt her for the next 5 years until fate brought her face to face with the consequences of that decision on live national television. The Kenyan sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, painting the savannah in shades of amber and despair. Elizabeth wiped the sweat from her brow as she trudged through the withered grass, her water bottle nearly empty despite the early hour. 3 months into the worst drought in decades, and the landscape told the story of a land forgotten by rain. Acacia trees stood skeletal against the bleached sky, their leaves long since surrendered to the relentless heat. She had volunteered for this conservation project expecting adventure, perhaps even romance with the wild. What she found instead was heartbreak on an industrial scale. Every day brought new casualties: emaciated zebras collapsed by dried riverbeds, elephant calves too weak to keep pace with their desperately searching herds, and the constant gnawing knowledge that nature's cruelty knew no bounds. The mewling sound stopped her dead in her tracks. It was barely audible above the cicada's drone, but unmistakably feline, weak, plaintive, and utterly alone. Elizabeth followed the sound through a cluster of termite mounds until she found him. A lion cub no bigger than a house cat, his golden fur matted with dust and his ribs clearly visible beneath his tiny frame. His eyes, when they fluttered open at her approach, were the color of storm clouds, and they held a depth of suffering that seemed impossible in something so small. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. The cub's breathing was shallow, labored. No mother in sight, no pride to claim him. In this drought, survival was a luxury even adult lions couldn't afford. Abandoning the weakest was simply mathematics. Elizabeth knew the protocol. Document the discovery, radio the research station, let nature take its course. That was the rule. Observe, don't interfere. But as those gray eyes fixed on hers with what seemed like recognition, something fundamental shifted inside her chest. This wasn't just another casualty of the drought. This was a choice. Her hands moved of their own accord, scooping the fragile body against her chest. The cub's warmth was barely perceptible, his heartbeat a flutter against her palm. She reached for her water bottle, letting precious drops fall between his parched lips, watching as his pink tongue darted out instinctively. "I've got you," she murmured, though she had no idea what that promise would cost her. "I've got you, Shadow." The name came unbidden, inspired by how he seemed to materialize from the very landscape like a ghost made flesh. As she cradled him closer, Elizabeth felt the weight of an invisible line being crossed. She was no longer just an observer in this vast theater of survival. She was writing herself into the story, claiming responsibility for a life that the world had already written off. The walk back to camp seemed endless, each step a commitment to the impossible. With every breath the cub drew against her chest, Elizabeth felt herself becoming something new. Not just a conservationist, but a mother to a creature who would grow to embody everything wild and dangerous and beautiful about Africa itself. The first weeks with Shadow blurred into a rhythm of sleepless nights and tender discoveries. Every 2 hours, my alarm would pierce the darkness, summoning me from dreams to the reality of a tiny, hungry creature whose survival depended entirely on my vigilance. I'd stumble to the kitchen, warm the milk substitute to just the right temperature, and return to find Shadow already stirring in his makeshift den of blankets, his small whimpers cutting through the silence like whispered prayers. Those midnight feedings became sacred rituals. In the soft glow of a single lamp, I'd cradle his fragile body against my chest, feeling the rapid flutter of his heartbeat as he latched onto the bottle with desperate intensity. His eyes, still clouded with the milky blue of infancy, would fix on mine with an ancient trust that humbled me. Sometimes he'd fall asleep mid-feeding, milk dribbling from the corner of his mouth, his tiny paws kneading against my arm in contentment. As weeks dissolved into months, our nocturnal routine evolved. Shadow's appetite grew voracious, and I introduced him to solid foods. First softened kibble mixed with formula, then small pieces of raw meat that awakened something primal in his amber eyes. I watched him learn to tear and chew, his movements becoming more confident, more wild with each passing day. The real education began under moonlight. On clear nights, I'd carry him outside, his body now sturdy enough to explore beyond the safety of indoor walls. I taught him to track scents, following invisible trails across the dewy grass with my flashlight dimmed to preserve the mystery of darkness. His nose would twitch and quiver, processing information I could never comprehend. When he caught his first mouse, a clumsy pounce that ended in surprise success, his joy was infectious, tail wagging frantically as he brought his prize to my feet like an offering. These moonlit lessons revealed Shadow's true nature. He was becoming something magnificent and untamed, yet our bond only deepened with each shared adventure. He'd press against my legs when owls called from distant trees, seeking comfort from the only parent he'd ever known. When coyotes howled in the far hills, Shadow would lift his muzzle and release his own tentative response, a sound that sent shivers through my soul. By autumn, our midnight routine had transformed from necessity to choice. Shadow no longer needed constant feeding, but he'd still wake and pad to my bedside, amber eyes reflecting starlight as he invited me into his nocturnal world. Those quiet hours belonged to us alone. Teacher and student, parent and child, two souls bound by trust forged in darkness and sealed under countless moonlit skies. In caring for Shadow, I discovered that raising a wild heart required surrendering pieces of my own, until the boundary between his wildness and my humanity became beautifully, irrevocably blurred. The calendar on Elizabeth's phone showed the date she'd been dreading for weeks. her last day at Moonrise Sanctuary. 6 months had passed in what felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat, and now the volunteer program that had brought her here was ending. Her replacement, a young graduate student from Colorado, would arrive next week eager and bright-eyed, just as Elizabeth had been. She found Shadow in his usual morning spot, stretched beneath the old pine where golden sunlight filtered through the branches. At her approach, his ears perked forward, and those amber eyes that had become as familiar as her own reflection met hers with what she could only describe as understanding. Did he know? Could he sense the change in her rhythm, the heaviness that had settled over her these past few days? "Hey, beautiful boy," she whispered, settling beside him as she had countless times before. Her fingers found the spot behind his ears that made him lean into her touch, a soft rumble of contentment vibrating through his chest. The simple gesture nearly broke her resolve. Shadow had been making remarkable progress. The veterinary team had cleared him for release pending final behavioral assessments, but the timeline remained uncertain, somewhere between 3 weeks and 3 months. Elizabeth had applied for an extension to her volunteer term, but funding constraints meant her position would remain unfilled until the next cycle began in spring. By then, Shadow would likely be running free in his mountain home, a wild creature once again. She tried to convince herself this was temporary. She could return as a visitor, perhaps volunteer again next year. But the rational part of her mind, the part that understood wildlife rehabilitation, knew better. Once Shadow was released, he would need to forget human contact entirely. Any continued connection could jeopardize his survival in the wild. "You're going to be magnificent out there," she told him, her voice catching slightly. "You're going to run faster than the wind and hunt under starlight just like you were meant to." Shadow's head tilted at the emotion in her tone, and he pressed closer against her leg. The sanctuary director had been kind but clear. Attachment was natural, even beneficial during the rehabilitation process, but letting go was equally crucial. Elizabeth understood the logic, respected the necessity, but knowledge did nothing to ease the ache in her chest. As the afternoon sun began its descent, Elizabeth made her final rounds, checking water containers and securing enclosures with mechanical precision. Each task felt weighted with finality. Shadow watched her from the fence line, his gaze tracking her movements with an intensity that suggested he too sensed this was different. When she finally approached his gate for the last time, Elizabeth placed her palm flat against the chain link. Shadow rose and padded over, pressing his nose to the metal near her hand. They stayed like that as shadows lengthened around them, separated by barrier and necessity, connected by something deeper than either fully understood. Tomorrow she would drive away, carrying with her the memory of amber eyes and the hope that love sometimes meant learning to let go. 3 years later, Elizabeth Chen's name appeared in gleaming letters across the bottom third of television screens throughout the tri-state area. The evening news desk at Channel 7 had become her kingdom, her teleprompter reflection polished to perfection, her voice the trusted companion to millions during their dinner hours. Awards lined her Manhattan apartment. 2 Emmys, a Polk, recognition from the Associated Press. Her career trajectory had been nothing short of meteoric. Yet success tasted different than she'd imagined during those hungry years of climbing the media ladder. The corner office overlooked Central Park, but Elizabeth found herself drawn to the single window that faced west, watching the sun disappear behind concrete and steel rather than mountains. The city's rhythm had replaced the sanctuary's gentle cadence. Sirens instead of birdsong, honking horns instead of wind through pine branches. Her colleagues saw confidence, ambition realized. They saw the woman who'd broken the mayor's corruption story, who'd interviewed presidents and celebrities with equal poise. What they couldn't see was how she'd wake some mornings reaching for phantom fur, expecting the warm weight of a wolf's head against her leg. How she'd catch herself listening for the sound of paws on earth instead of heels on marble. The irony wasn't lost on her. She reported on wildlife conservation stories with particular passion, her voice taking on a different quality when discussing habitat preservation or endangered species legislation. Producers had noticed, assigning her more environmental segments. She'd become the network's unofficial voice for nature stories, though none of them knew why her eyes seemed to hold shadows when the cameras stopped rolling. Elizabeth had tried to fill the void in conventional ways. There had been relationships, a fellow journalist who appreciated her drive, a photographer who shared her love of early mornings. But conversations felt hollow when she found herself editing out references to a wolf who had shaped her understanding of loyalty. How do you explain to someone that a wild animal had taught you more about love than any human ever had? The city's parks became her refuges. She'd walk the wooded paths of Inwood Hill Park at dawn, before the joggers and dog walkers arrived, pretending the distant traffic was whined through trees. Sometimes she'd spot the urban hawks that nested on building ledges and wonder if Shadow ever looked up at the sky and remembered a human who'd once sat beside him in comfortable silence. Professional accolades accumulated like autumn leaves, beautiful, numerous, but somehow brittle. Each achievement felt like another step away from the person she'd been during those 6 months when her purpose had been as simple as earning the trust of a wounded creature. The spotlight that had once seemed so alluring now felt harsh compared to the gentle warmth of mountain sunlight filtering through pine needles. At night, when the city finally quieted to a whisper, Elizabeth would stand at her window and wonder if somewhere in the wilderness, amber eyes were watching the same moon that now seemed smaller, somehow diminished by the urban glow surrounding it. The studio lights blazed with an intensity that made Sarah's eyes water, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened when the cage door opened. 3 years had passed since she'd last seen Kasai, the cheetah cub she'd rescued from poachers in Kenya's Masai Mara. Now, cameras rolled as the reunion unfolded before a live television audience of 12 million viewers. The moment Kasai caught her scent, everything changed. The magnificent cat, now fully grown with muscles rippling beneath his spotted coat, froze mid-stride. His golden eyes locked onto Sarah's face with a recognition that transcended species. Then came the sound, a deep rumbling purr that resonated through the television speakers and into living rooms across the globe. What followed defied every expectation. Kasai approached slowly, deliberately, his massive frame moving with the grace that only cheetahs possess. When he reached Sarah, he did something that made the studio audience gasp collectively. He gently pressed his forehead against hers, just as he had as a cub. The purring intensified, and Sarah's tears flowed freely as she whispered words of greeting in broken Swahili. Host Michael Davidson, known for his composure during decades of live television, found himself speechless. The cameras captured every nuance. Sarah's trembling hands as she stroked Kasai's neck, the way the cheetah seemed to melt into her touch, the profound connection that pulsed between human and wild animal. 90 seconds of pure magic that would be replayed millions of times in the hours that followed. The immediate aftermath was electric. Social media exploded before the commercial break even ended. The hashtag Cheetah Whisperer began trending within minutes, climbing to the top of Twitter's global trends faster than any wildlife conservation story in history. Instagram flooded with videos of the reunion, each post garnering hundreds of thousands of views. Television networks scrambled to secure follow-up interviews. Major news outlets from CNN to the BBC contacted Sarah's representatives within the hour. Conservation organizations watched their donation websites crash from overwhelming traffic as viewers, moved by what they'd witnessed, opened their wallets to support wildlife protection efforts. But perhaps most remarkably, the reunion sparked something deeper than viral fame. Wildlife experts who had dismissed emotional connections between humans and wild animals found themselves reconsidering long-held beliefs. Dr. Sherry Martin, a prominent animal behaviorist, admitted on her own show 2 days later that what she'd witnessed challenged everything she thought she knew about interspecies bonds. The video would go on to amass over 50 million views across platforms within a week. It inspired documentaries, academic papers, and a new generation of conservationists. Children around the world began drawing pictures of cheetahs and their human friends. Zoos reported unprecedented increases in attendance for their big cat exhibits. Those 90 seconds didn't just reunite two unlikely friends. They reminded an entire planet that the bonds between humans and nature run deeper than we ever dared imagine. Elizabeth's phone hadn't stopped buzzing in 72 hours. The notifications cascaded down her screen like digital rain. Interview requests, speaking engagements, book deals, documentary proposals. The reunion video had made her an overnight sensation, but fame felt more like drowning than flying. She sat in her corner office on the 34th floor, staring at the spreadsheets that had defined her life for the past 8 years. Risk assessments, profit margins, quarterly projections. Numbers that once brought comfort now seemed meaningless. Outside her window, Manhattan pulsed with its usual urgency, But Elizabeth felt disconnected from it all, as if watching life unfold through thick glass. The grief hit her without warning during a client meeting. One moment she was explaining market volatility, the next she was excusing herself to cry in the bathroom stall, overwhelmed by memories she'd buried beneath years of corporate climbing. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, how he'd called her his little explorer when she brought home injured birds and stray cats. How he'd promised they'd visit Africa together someday to see the animals she drew obsessively in her childhood notebooks. That someday never came. Cancer stole him when Elizabeth was 16, and with him went her dreams of veterinary school, of conservation work, of anything that didn't guarantee financial security. Her mother's quiet desperation had taught her that safety meant stable paychecks and sensible choices. So Elizabeth chose accounting, chose predictability, chose to bury the girl who once wanted to heal the world's broken creatures. But Kasai had awakened something she thought was dead. The cheetah's recognition had been more than a reunion. It was a reckoning. Each purr, each gentle touch had whispered the same message. You remember who you really are. The decision crystallized during her lunch break, as she watched the video for the 100th time. Comments poured in from viewers whose lives had been changed by those 90 seconds. A 12-year-old in Ohio wrote that she wanted to become a wildlife veterinarian. A retiree in Australia had donated his savings to anti-poaching efforts. A young mother in Brazil was planning her first trip to Kenya. Elizabeth closed her laptop with trembling hands. She walked to her supervisor's office, past the motivational posters and award plaques that had once meant everything. When she tendered her resignation, citing personal pursuits, her boss looked at her as if she'd announced plans to live on Mars. That evening, Elizabeth called the Kenyan Wildlife Service. Her voice shook as she inquired about volunteer positions, conservation programs, anything that would get her back to where she belonged. The woman on the other end of the line laughed warmly when Elizabeth mentioned the reunion video. Ah, the cheetah whisperer, she said. We've been hoping you'd call. For the first time in years, Elizabeth smiled through her tears. The safety net was gone, but she was finally ready to fly. The red dust of Nairobi's Wilson Airport clung to Elizabeth's shoes as she stepped off the small charter plane, her heart hammering against her ribs. 6 months had passed since she'd walked away from her Manhattan office, trading her corner view of Central Park for something far more uncertain. The acacia trees dotted the horizon like old friends welcoming her home, their thorny branches reaching toward a sky so vast it made her dizzy with possibility. Dr. Kamau was waiting by the jeep, his weathered face breaking into the same warm smile she remembered from 3 years ago. Isaac Fugate, he said, extending his hand. Welcome home. The words hit her deeper than she expected, and she had to blink back tears as they drove through the familiar landscape of the Masai Mara. When they crested the hill overlooking the research station, Elizabeth saw him immediately. Shadow sat beneath the fever tree where she'd first found him as an injured cub, his obsidian coat gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The Black Panther's rare melanistic beauty had always taken her breath away, but now, seeing him healthy and magnificent, she felt something break open in her chest. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, Shadow knew she was coming. As their jeep approached, he rose with fluid grace and began padding toward them, his golden eyes never leaving her face. The reunion was quieter than the televised moment with Kasai, but no less profound. Shadow approached slowly, cautiously, then pressed his massive head against her palm with a rumbling purr that vibrated through her entire being. He's been waiting, Dr. Kamau said softly. Every day since we told him you were returning, he's come to this spot. Within weeks, the paperwork was filed and the Thomas Wildlife Foundation was born, named for her father who never got to see the African animals he'd helped her dream about. The abandoned research station became her sanctuary, literally and figuratively. With the money from her liquidated investment portfolio and the flood of donations that continued pouring in from the viral video, Elizabeth began transforming the compound into a refuge for Kenya's most vulnerable wildlife. The work was backbreaking, dangerous, and financially precarious. Sleepless nights treating injured animals, navigating corrupt officials, and battling poachers who resented her presence. Her manicured nails became permanently stained with mud and antiseptic. Her designer wardrobe gave way to khaki and canvas. But each morning, when she stepped out of her simple quarters to find Shadow waiting by her door, when she heard the rumbling contentment of healing animals, When she watched orphaned cubs take their first tentative steps back toward wildness, Elizabeth knew she had found what she'd been searching for without even knowing it was missing. She was finally home.
We appreciate you seeing the entire story. You will definitely enjoy the following story if you like this one. As you may imagine, it's more bizarre and fascinating. To view the next one, click on the image that is currently displayed on the screen.